Warning! Before we begin tonight's episode, we need to say something clearly and without sarcasm. The State of the Union is not just another news cycle moment. It is a constitutionally rooted address delivered before Congress and the American people. It represents the office, not just the individual. On this show, we analyze policy, rhetoric, and political strategy from a conservative lens, but we do not promote violence, harassment, or blind allegiance to any political figure. You are going to hear strong opinions tonight. You are going to hear criticism. You may even hear frustration. That does not mean we hate America. It means we care deeply about its direction. If you disagree, that's fine. Listen anyway. Challenge us in good faith, but leave the personal attacks at the door. This is Data and Dissonance. We speak directly, we speak honestly, and we expect adults in the room.
Last night, millions of Americans sat in their living rooms and watched two completely different realities unfold at the same time. Some saw strength, some saw spectacle, some saw momentum, others saw messaging. But no matter which side you lean toward, one thing is undeniable. The State of the Union wasn't just about policy, it was about power. It was about narrative control. It was about who gets to define what winning actually looks like in 2026. President Trump stood in front of Congress for nearly 2 hours and declared America stronger than ever, economically, militarily, culturally. He doubled down on border enforcement, tax cuts, shrinking government, and what he calls a new American golden age. Meanwhile, Democrats staged protests, fact-checkers worked overtime, and cable news split the screen into applause versus eye rolls. So tonight, we're not doing surface-level reactions. We're digging into what was actually said, what conservatives are celebrating, what critics are attacking, and what this speech signals heading into the midterms. Because this wasn't just a recap, this was a line drawn in the sand. All right, let's bring in the crew, because tonight's conversation deserves some serious perspective. Brian is in the building, and if there was ever a night for MAGA Fire energy, this is it. Brian sees the State of the Union as a scoreboard moment. Wins on the economy, wins on the border, wins on standing firm while the opposition disrupts and postures. He's not here to nitpick delivery. He's here to talk results, momentum, and whether last night proved that the America First agenda is not only alive, but accelerating. Rachel is here as always, grounded, analytical, independent-minded. She's not interested in cheering or booing. She's asking, did the speech match reality? Do the numbers line up with the rhetoric? And more importantly, how does this land with voters who aren't glued to conservative media or progressive outrage machines? She's watching tone, strategy, and whether this speech broadens support or just energizes the base. Daniel is back at the desk, and you already know he's not just looking at the teleprompter lines. He's watching the optics, the staged reactions, the walkouts, the guest invites, the camera cuts. He wants to know who benefited from what moment, who coordinated what reaction, and whether the speech itself was policy, or a carefully constructed political chess move aimed straight at the midterms. And Skylar is here tonight as well, bringing the progressive, green-leaning perspective. She's not buying into golden age language without questioning who's actually benefiting. She's going to challenge the economic claims, the border framing, and the cultural messaging. Expect her to push back on what she sees as selective storytelling and to bring up healthcare, climate, and working class concerns that didn't get primetime applause. That's the table tonight. 4 very different lenses, one major speech, and let's get into it. Last night, President Donald Trump stood before Congress and delivered what may go down as one of the most politically defining speeches of his second term. Nearly 2 hours long, heavy on applause lines, sharp contrasts, and unapologetic framing, it wasn't a soft unity speech. It was a declaration. He called the economy stronger than ever, pointed to market highs, manufacturing returns, border enforcement numbers, and a renewed sense of national pride. He painted a picture of what he called a golden age resurgence, while critics were quick to point to inflation pressure, federal deficit concerns, and partisan gridlock. Democrats protested at moments. Republicans stood and roared at others. Social media split instantly into celebration and condemnation. But here's the question that matters to our audience tonight. Was this a factual scoreboard speech or a campaign rally delivered from the House chamber? Brian, I'm coming to you first. From a conservative standpoint, was last night a legitimate case that America is on the right track under this administration? Or was it more about energizing the base ahead of the midterms than persuading the middle?
Look, I don't even think this is complicated. Last night wasn't a rally. It was a results speech. When President Trump stood there and talked about record market performance, about reshoring manufacturing, about tightening up border enforcement, and pushing back on the chaos that defined the previous years. He wasn't freelancing. He was pointing to measurable shifts. You can debate tone, you can debate delivery, but you can't ignore the fact that small business optimism has ticked upward, energy production has expanded, and illegal crossing numbers have dropped compared to peak crisis levels. Conservatives aren't celebrating vibes. They're celebrating direction. And that's what the left hates. They don't hate the style nearly as much as they hate that the policy framework is working in areas they said would collapse. Now, was it energizing to the base? Of course it was. It should be. That's leadership. You don't get elected to whisper about incremental change. You get elected to lay out a vision and defend it. And what I saw last night was a president refusing to apologize for prioritizing American workers, border security, and domestic energy independence. When Democrats stage their little protest moments, it honestly just reinforced the contrast. One side standing and applauding growth and enforcement, the other side holding signs and rolling eyes. If you're an independent voter watching that split screen, you're asking yourself which group looks serious about governing. That contrast may matter more than any individual statistic.
All right, Brian, that's a strong defense. And I get the argument. Direction matters, momentum matters, but here's where I land personally. Tone and timing matter too. When a president says the country is stronger than ever, that's a bold claim. And if you're a family still budgeting every grocery trip or watching interest rates eat into your monthly payment, that phrase can either inspire confidence or feel disconnected. I think last night was intentionally confident, almost defiant. It wasn't a unity-first speech. It was a contrast speech. And strategically, that may fire up the base heading into midterms. But the gamble is whether independents heard optimism or heard overstatement. In my opinion, Trump wasn't trying to convert critics last night. He was consolidating support and drawing a hard line. That's not necessarily wrong politically, but it's risky because the middle of the country doesn't live on cable news. They live in real numbers and real bills, and that's where this speech either sticks or doesn't. Rachel, I want you to step in here. From a grounded, independent lens, did the economic framing match everyday reality? And more importantly, did this speech actually broaden the conversation, or did it mostly solidify the camps that were already formed?
What stood out to me last night wasn't just what was said. It was how confidently it was said. The stronger than ever framing is powerful rhetoric. But rhetoric only works when people feel it in their day-to-day lives. Yes, markets are up. Yes, certain sectors like energy and domestic manufacturing are trending positively. Those are legitimate data points. But at the same time, household debt remains high, housing affordability is strained in many regions, and cost of living pressure hasn't disappeared just because unemployment is stable. So when you use sweeping language like golden age, you risk sounding disconnected from families who are still stretching their paychecks. Politically, though, I think this was intentional. This wasn't designed to persuade MSNBC viewers or progressive activists. It was designed to reassure conservatives who want strong leadership language and to project stability heading into midterms. The speech reinforced the idea of direction, border enforcement, shrinking bureaucracy, tax relief, but it didn't spend much time acknowledging lingering pain points. That's where independents might hesitate. They want confidence, but they also want acknowledgement of reality. The protests from Democrats inside the chamber may have helped the president visually, because contrast is powerful television. But contrast cuts both ways. If voters perceive that neither side is speaking directly to their financial stress, frustration with Washington, or fatigue from constant political escalation, they tune out both camps. So I think the speech solidified support very effectively. But whether it expanded it, that's still an open question.
That's a fair take, and I think you nailed something important: acknowledgement. There's strength in confidence, but there's also strength in saying, we're improving, but we're not finished. Last night leaned heavily into victory framing. And politically, that project's control. But if you miss that humility note, some people feel unseen. Here's my opinion. The optics of Democrats protesting may have handed Trump a visual win. The camera doesn't lie about who's standing and who's holding signs. But visuals are short-term. Policy reality is long-term. If economic gains continue and people start feeling it more tangibly, this speech ages well. If they don't, critics replay the stronger than ever line as evidence of overreach. Daniel, I want you to step in here. Forget the policy specifics for a second. From an optics and strategy standpoint, Was this speech about governing or about shaping perception? And do you think the protests and reactions were organic or part of a broader political chess match playing out in real time?
Let's be honest, State of the Union speeches are never just about governing. They're about framing the year ahead. And last night, what I saw was a masterclass in narrative construction. The length alone signaled dominance. Almost 2 hours says, I control the floor, I control the conversation. That's not accidental. It forces networks to carry it wall to wall. It squeezes rebuttal windows, and it floods the information space before critics can consolidate a counter-message. That's strategy, not spontaneity. Then you look at the guest placements, the cultural symbols, the carefully timed applause lines about border enforcement and economic revival, even the pauses. Those weren't random, they were engineered for replay value. When Democrats held up signs or staged protest moments, that too became part of the spectacle. The camera loves contrast, and contrast helps the speaker. If you're a strategist in the West Wing, you almost welcome visible opposition because it reinforces your us versus them framing. Whether the protests were coordinated down to the second, hard to prove. But in modern politics, nothing at that level is purely organic. Everyone comes in knowing the beats. And here's the deeper layer. This speech wasn't just aimed at voters, it was aimed at narrative gatekeepers. It challenges media framing by overwhelming it. If fact-checkers spend the next 48 hours dissecting specific claims, they're still amplifying the themes: border, economy, sovereignty, strength. It becomes repetition through criticism. That's perception warfare 101. So yes, this was governing language, but it was also psychological positioning ahead of the midterms. It wasn't about converting the opposition, it was about consolidating energy, projecting inevitability, and daring the other side to overreact.
Daniel, that's a layered take, and whether people agree or not, there's truth in the idea that modern politics is optics first. The presidency today isn't just about policy memos, it's about controlling the screen, and last night felt like a controlled broadcast. Confident, forceful, deliberate. My opinion, I think both things can be true. A president can believe in his policy direction and still deliver a speech designed for maximum narrative impact. That's not conspiracy, that's politics in 2026. The real question isn't whether it was strategic. Of course it was. The question is whether the strategy resonates beyond the loyal base. Because at the end of the day, midterms are won in the margins. Skylar, I want to bring you in here. From a progressive and green-leaning perspective, when you watched last night, what did you hear that concerned you most? And do you think the economic and border framing left out critical issues like healthcare access, climate policy, and working-class struggles that don't always show up in market numbers?
What stood out to me most wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. When you frame the country as entering a golden age, but barely acknowledge climate pressures, healthcare costs, or wage stagnation in lower-income communities, that's a selective narrative. Yes, markets can rise. Yes, manufacturing announcements can look good on paper, but there are entire regions still struggling with hospital closures, unaffordable prescriptions, and environmental damage that doesn't show up in a Dow Jones chart. If you're living near refineries or dealing with extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent, stronger than ever feels incomplete. The border framing also concerned me. Linking immigration enforcement repeatedly with crime rhetoric might energize a base, but it risks oversimplifying a complex humanitarian and labor issue. There are asylum backlogs, legal workforce gaps, and international instability factors that don't fit into applause lines. When those nuances get left out, it hardens fear rather than fosters solutions. And fear-based messaging can mobilize, but it also divides. Politically, I agree with something Daniel said. This was about consolidation. It wasn't an outreach speech. It was a positioning speech, but that's part of the problem. The country is fatigued. People are exhausted from binary framing the strong versus weak, patriotic versus anti-American, secure versus open borders. Many Americans want policy depth, not just contrast. So from my perspective, the speech may have succeeded strategically by lie, but it didn't move the needle toward unity or comprehensive solutions on climate resilience, healthcare affordability, or long-term economic inequality. And those gaps matter just as much as stock numbers.
Skylar, I appreciate that perspective. And here's where I think tonight's conversation lands. What we witnessed last night wasn't just a policy report. It was a directional statement. Conservatives heard confidence and momentum. Progressives heard omission and escalation. Independents likely heard strength, but may still be waiting to feel it personally. In my view, this speech was not designed to unify the chamber. It was designed to define the battlefield heading into midterms. It drew bright lines on border security, economic growth, and shrinking federal power. It leaned into contrast instead of compromise. Whether that pays off politically depends on one thing. Do Americans feel upward movement over the next several months? Because rhetoric can carry you for a news cycle, but lived experience carries elections, and that's the real takeaway. We're going to step aside for a quick merch drop, and then I'll give you my final thoughts on what this moment means long term.
Before we get into final thoughts, let me say this. If you believe in independent media, if you believe in long-form conversations that aren't clipped into 10-second outrage bait, then support the platforms that refuse to play that game. Head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store. We've got the coffee lineup, High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium Roast, and the bold Bitterroot French Roast, roasted right here in the USA. Whether you're listening to a State of the Union recap at 6 a.m. or prepping for your commute home, that cup hits different when it fuels independent thought. We've also got the Gen X gear, the bumper stickers, hoodies, hats, and the newer drops like Make Orwell Fiction Again and Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms. It's not just merch, it's signal. And as always, everything supports the show, the books, and the mission behind this project. Building something real, something independent, something that speaks truth without corporate filters. All right, let's land this plane.
Last night's State of the Union wasn't just another speech. It was a political marker in the sand. It told the country, here's the direction, here's the philosophy, here's the fight. Whether you cheered it or critiqued it, you can't deny that it was intentional, confident, and confrontational. I think the bigger story isn't the applause lines or the protests. It's what happens next. Speeches don't govern, policies do, data does, paychecks do, grocery receipts do, border numbers do, energy output does. If the administration's claims of strength and resurgence translate into tangible improvement for everyday Americans, then this speech becomes a cornerstone moment. If they don't, critics will replay those confident declarations as overreach. What we saw was consolidation, not compromise, projection, not persuasion. And maybe that's where we are as a country right now. Less focused on convincing the other side and more focused on rallying our own. That may win elections, but it doesn't automatically heal divisions. The real test won't be cable commentary or social media clips. It'll be how people feel 6 months from now. Stronger than ever isn't a slogan. It's a standard, and standards have to be measurable. We'll keep watching, we'll keep questioning, we'll keep breaking it down without fear or blind loyalty. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about party, it's about direction. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. Because if you enjoy political tension, strategic maneuvering, and high-stakes battles over the future of the country, you'll love where these stories go when the cameras are off and the microphones are muted. Start with The Covenant Protocol, a story about power, corruption, and the fight to expose what operates behind the curtain. Then move into The Prophet Directive, where the stakes escalate and the lines between government authority and individual liberty blur in ways that feel a little too real. And Book 3, Black Echo Rising, continues that fight with deeper political intrigue, national security pressure, and the kind of moral crossroads that define a republic. If tonight's conversation about narrative control, optics, and political chess sparked something in you, those books take that same tension and turn it into a story you can't put down. And don't forget the music side of the brand. The album Uncaged brought raw energy and unapologetic conviction, while Four Wheelers and Hallelujah blends patriotism, faith, and blue-collar grit into something that feels like Backroads and Front Porch America all at once. Everything ties together, the show, the books, the music, because it all comes from the same place, fighting for truth, legacy, and something bigger than headlines. Support independent creators, support long-form conversation, support stories that don't bend with every news cycle.